They don't want you to feel hope, because when you don't feel hope, it allows you to be susceptible to propaganda, to be shut down, to opt out of your part to play in change.
Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a trauma-informed therapist, life coach and disruptor of wellness norms based in Brighton, UK. This isn't another nice-to-have wellness podcast. Instead, this podcast seeks to redefine what it means to be well in today's world. Here, we challenge the status quo, seek to reunite wellness with social justice and improve accessibility, diversity and inclusivity within wellness and beyond. As a listener, you are not here to passively consume. Instead, you are an ambassador for real, embodied, societal and systemic change in the world. As your host, I stand for radical self-inquiry and being able to have those confronting but necessary conversations so that we can remember our collective humanity at this time. We're here for the revolution and you've got a front row seat. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for this.
Awesome. Now, for those who haven't come across your work, I would love for you just to introduce yourself in any way that feels meaningful for you today.
So my name is Kaia, my pronouns are she, her. I guess how I describe myself has changed across the years, but the most consistent thing is an activist, first and foremost. That's where the origins of my story come from, specialising in racial justice and racial equity. How that translates is in my work with schools, with Youth the Gap, but also with my work with diversity and inclusion consultancy, which is As Your Difference. I do many different things within that, such as a trustee, I'm a creative, and other pockets. The most consistent thing is the activist lens, which means it's grassroots. I'm really just trying to demystify things where it isn't just the advocates or the activists who apparently know it all or have all the lingo. Justice is for everybody and should be an accessible point of entry. So that's what I'm really passionate about.
Amazing. You know, we all say, oh, we've all got the same hours in the day, but it seems like you've got an insatiable amount of hours in the day for everything that you do. So amazing. I know that you're an incredibly busy bee. Over the last month, we've obviously had Black History Month. Mm-hmm. So we're just coming to the end of that on the date of recording. How has this past month been for you during Black History Month? What have you been involved with?
Mm-hmm. It's been an interesting year, and I've had many conversations with people who are also in the scene. It's been the quietest Black History Month that we've had probably in the past 5 years with BLM, which is not surprising. I think I was almost awaiting this moment where it felt like crickets were very loud this year. I think I was very lucky in terms of the opportunities that came my way where I was still able to do some things and that being meaningful. Because I think this year as well, I really wanted to set almost like the boundaries in place in terms of where I would show up. So if it means in terms of my speech and how I'm limited, if I can't speak about genocide, if I can't speak about anti-Blackness, if I can't speak about the much more quote unquote heavier topics, then I will not be there, you know? So I think for me, it was going to be a year of setting that tone anyway, but that translated to there being less opportunities from corporate. I guess also there being more opportunities that were not funded. So come speak for us for free. And we're like, that's great. You can have my ghost there instead, you know? It's been a very interesting year. It's almost very topical with everything going on. The silence doesn't exist in a vacuum, but also making an opportunity for it to be intersectional because there's so many ongoing crises going on. So I think almost what I did this year, which was to really hit home with Congo, Sudan, and the many other places where our siblings are oppressed and really bring that to light. Black history this year felt a lot more of let's bring awareness to the trauma that has been deliberately shadowed and how can we do that through a collective lens. Even as we're recording, we know that there's a hurricane heading to Jamaica, and that also being that kind of link in there in terms of the global atrocities going on and who is complicit and who has caused it.
It's really interesting to hear you comment that it's been the quietest Black History Month that you've recognised, the loudest crickets, as you said. I'm curious from your perspective why that is.
Because it's no longer trendy. 3 years ago, I did a TEDx talk all around this, which really was the what I call how we can decolonize revolution, because I think we think revolution is very much, we've got protests and we're up in arms and it's a constant fight, which is one microcosm of the whole collective picture when we think about revolution, but it isn't the ongoing fight of it. When people think of protest, they disconnect themselves from revolution because they can't see themselves being a part of an ongoing picture of protest. That became a global phenomenon, and I think it was released by the Mayo Clinic in 2020, when they analysed the 3-month period in terms of people's window of peak in terms of engaging with BLM and how it stagnated and it dropped in that 3-month period. And really what I started to understand with that from my own experience of organising BLM during 2020, that we went from 15,000 people to 100 by the end of the campaign. And that was a global series of things. It wasn't just happening at my protest, it was happening with other protests that were going on, because it no longer became trendy. People felt like they weren't a part of that picture. They weren't getting the immediate gratification of the results of being a part of a movement. I think whether it is through the lens of social media, whether it is through the lack of education in terms of what revolution actually means versus what people illustrate it to be, there's a massive disconnect. With BLM, there was a lot of social pressure during 2020 to talk about it, which is why there was so much money being declared to be funded back into the Black community. From reading a post recently, around 20 million was going to be invested into Black communities. They only ended up spending across the 5 years 9 million. So it shows an economic gap, which most probably was spent within the first 2 years, but going forward it wasn't spent at all because it no longer became trendy. When we see people's lives and lived experiences as trends we can opt in and out of, not only is that injustice at its core and the privilege at its core, but speaks to a much wider problem, which is that disconnection from the humanness of it all. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, totally. It makes so much sense. And I think during the course of this conversation, we'll get more into sustained allyship. I just wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the appearances you chose to have during this past Black History Month, you referenced your desire to speak to the intersectionality of all these things, not just speaking to one area of Black liberation, but then also wanting to bring in ongoing genocide to Sudan, to Congo. I really think that's an important point to bring into the conversation, because many people, they kind of see many different things as like isolated events that are going on with different parts of the world, whereas what you're speaking to is important, like the intersectionality and the interconnected web of all of these things and the systems behind it. So can you just talk the intersectionality of this global struggle?
That's a really good question. I think when people think of Palestine, they don't think of Israel's complicity within Congo, for example, who owns the illegal mining in Congo. It goes back to Israeli settlements within Congo. When we think about the atrocities going on in Sudan, it is backed by the global north. So when we think about the huge picture of it, it isn't just in isolation of this is happening over here or this is happening in this area. Actually, the struggles are deeply connected. If we have the understanding that the liberation of Congo and Sudan means the liberation of Palestine, the liberation of Palestine means that we can understand how to liberate Congo and Sudan, that's how we're able to put it together. But there's obviously not going to be some ongoing education out there to say that this is the reason why, and it is about bigger powers in place that are causing this. And it always comes back to the top 1% of people who own the wealth, who are misusing and abusing their power in order to exploit people in the South. It's drawing those connections to this big puzzle, which I think is really important to help us think, okay, it isn't just let's have a focus on Palestine and let's not focus on Sudan and Congo, which is something that I have seen within if we claim it as October 7th, which we know it's much wider than that. Yes, there has been a lot of education spotlighting of Congo and Sudan, but obviously not to the same degree. And then we can speak about anti-Blackness. It isn't just about it being tick for tack and thinking like, how come that, we were speaking about one, how can we speak about all of them? We must speak about all of them, because inevitably we know that the liberation of all these movements are piece and piece together, because they intersect widely. The struggles intersect. The people who are causing the harm intersect. So if we think about boycott, it's not just boycotting products that are complicit within the genocide of Palestinians. We think about a wider boycott and thinking, if I boycott this brand, I know it doesn't help in the liberation of Palestinians. It also stops with the liberation of Congo and Sudan. We have to think about who is causing the harm, which is the global north. on the global south. How do we put ourselves within it? It means that we think about it on an intersectional lens, because otherwise it will end up being something like white feminism, where it liberates some women, but not all women. We need to think about the liberation of everybody, and that's where intersectionality comes in. And I guess for those who are listening who don't know where it comes from, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to describe the intersectional nature of social characteristics.
Before we go on, I'd so appreciate you to hit follow or subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, click those 3 little dots next to settings to rate the show. On Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review, or take a moment to explore how you can rate or review on the platform that you're listening or watching. This makes a difference. I truly believe we need to have more of these conversations to shake up the status quo. We'll beat the algorithm together with your clicks and shares. Now back to the episode. I know a lot of your work is rooted in re-education. I was watching your TEDx talk yesterday, which was from 3 years ago, so a lot's happened since then. One thing you were speaking to was education. I heard you talking on another podcast around this as well. And on another previous episode that I had an amazing educator called Fernando de Veras on, who, if you haven't discovered him, or anyone that's listening doesn't follow him, I really do encourage it. He shared a quote from Paulo Freire's, oh my God, I can never say this word.
Oh my God.
There you go, thank you. We'd be here forever, of the oppressed. And it's that education can either be a tool for conformity or a tool for liberation, but never a neutral process.
100%.
You speak to your own experience of this and how it has inspired the work that you do.
That is such a good question. I think just in the lens, how I see education is that it isn't a structure set up around inspiring dreams and hopes and skilling people for the things they want to do. But an education that's designed to essentially manufacture workers without their consent of being a part of it. So what we want to be doing within the system is thinking about how can we essentially decolonize it and restructure it to really be at the heart of what education is virtue signaling it for it to be. So I see it through the lens of not only re-education, but also deeply unlearning, because there's a lot of things that we pick up in school that really I see translate to why people do things that they do now. For example, in school, you're only authorized to give an opinion if you raise your hand and you sit down and you're quiet. That same sense of fight or flight can be translated for you not feeling like you're able to speak up in a time of ongoing crisis, because you have been taught from the early days that it's not your place to do so unless you have somebody who gives you that consent. And I think also kind of links to why people fall for propaganda, because authority bias has a massive part to play in that, where we think of people who, whether it is people in suits or people who have nonverbal communication that signal them to have that sense of authority, that they're more likely to be trusted. So even if what they're saying is not in your best interest, the way in which they carry themselves and who they convey themselves to be may make you believe that or start to question your own judgments. Where's that come back to? You can't speak out against teachers, otherwise you go through the behaviour system. In terms of education, it's important to see how this structure was set up and the origins of it, but how it translates to the modern day. And I think in the age of AI, you have young people using AI without knowing to the fullest what it is capable of, who it is harming, and how it is really can be damaging for critical thinking skills. And on the other hand, you have teachers who are not equipped to deal with that, but are trying to police people's behaviour that kind of signals a much deeper problem than it is about people trying to cheat their way through the system. I think it speaks to the same worries, fears and weights people are holding within the system as it's deeply outdated, and people are learning things that actually don't want to learn. And we did a study back last year that kind of investigated around a sample size around 80 to 100 people around their experiences in education. And we concluded from that sample that 75% of people would say they had overall a negative experience in education. And that is from ages between 17 to 55. So it is a generational thing of carrying that burden of being like, actually, school is not serving its purpose. It is designed to therefore uphold a social hierarchy that is therefore not factual, but is very much helping to keep injustices going, because it manufactures and creates people that can be complicit, can be silent, because you are socializing them to believe that's all they can be. So when you're in education, you want young people to achieve what they want to be doing. It has to start with how you're treating them. And I think from being a teacher myself and then also being a youth worker, I've seen that it's not really the young people that are causing the problem. it is those who have the power to govern a classroom that can be causing the deepest issues, especially around self-identity and self-worth. So I think with that, it has to be a symbiosis between unlearning and relearning.
And, you know, in your TED talk, you talked about how revolution needs to be decolonized. I'm always interested in the conversation about how wellness needs to be decolonized. What I'm hearing from you there is how education, in fact, all the systems everywhere need to be decolonized. And something else that comes up for me on top of people being socialized or conditioned to be silent and to not raise their hand for fear of being embarrassed or shamed or told off or being wrong. There's something else that comes across for me that actually, when I think back to my own experience of education, you were rewarded for being the top, for being the expert, for being the leader. And I guess that it creates this idea within us, this very colonized idea, this top down, get to the top and you will be rewarded. Yeah. And that is something that needs to be deconditioned for a more equitable society. And, you know, I was at school a long time ago. When I think back to the version of history that I was told at school, in junior school, we did the Saxons, the Vikings and World War II multiple times over. In secondary school, for GCSE, I was studying World War II again. It's all very much centered around empire and the total expense of an erasure of a huge global majority. Would you say that is the case?
Oh, 100%. I think I'm speaking to a lot there in terms of the deliberate tools of the empire in action. One way is teaching about how empire can be maintained, and that is through a narrative they are trying to feed, especially the most vulnerable people who are young people who do not have, unless you are able to self-educate, which is literally what I did. Coming out of high school, I started to see the gaps and I thought, hang on, how come I'm only taught one poem about John Agar than checking out my history? And even then, when we see the phenomenon and how young people engage with that, it is full with embarrassment. They don't know how to talk about race. When teachers have to be accountable, they don't know how to take action. I think of Nova Reid's recent work of uncovering hidden Black history and especially Black British history, and she's done a phenomenal job with it. And I really think about, and something that won't leave me, is the part of the Haitian Revolution and the weaponization of spirituality against Black and global majority people, because it threatened the empire deeply. What they won't tell you is that they had to be in coalition with Haitian people because they could not be defeated. So when we think about that, there's a lot of deliberate hidings of history that because of the empire actually failing and not being as strong as it conveys itself to be. The empire will only maintain its power if it maintains that image. We know that empire can be deeply fragile. We are seeing a time of anti-migrant rhetoric. It's just rehashing the same kind of cards from the outdated deck always has done to maintain power where it feels fearful. The empire really is quaking in its boots for that respect, because it's starting to see people wake up. It's starting to see people protest. They don't want to see people out in the streets. They don't want to see people educating. They don't want to see people even being curious to question. Education is almost a tool for that, where it is not set up to question, it's set up for you to comply. And that compliance means that you're not set out to be a critical thinker. Even when you are a leader, it is in the leader in the confinements of what they embody that to be. Apparently, you've got 100% attendance the whole year round, which is something they feed into schools all the time. We need 100% attendance. You need to be getting top grades. And one key thing that we do with Youth to Gap that I don't think Ofsted really consider is the people demographic. So if you see a school that is apparently in need of improvement, oftentimes it means that they are deeply underfunded, understaffed, they are overworking to help a demographic, often young people coming through the door who with various intersections and are needing extra support. But the funding is not given to these schools to help. The education sector has a lot to answer for. We know the funding is not in education because they don't see it as a tool or a system set up for purpose or worth funding, even though it's a process that every young person goes through. So it speaks to the wider powers, which is why we don't demonize teachers or necessarily the curriculum itself to the same degree, because we know it is a wider problem in terms of who is funding it, who is constructing it. We need to adopt that advocacy lens in education to think that actually it's wider than an us problem. It is a bigger structural problem as well.
And how does your organisation aim to plug those gaps?
Yeah, really good question. What I've seen with other charities is that they go in and they do one-off projects. What we are currently doing with one local school that we're starting to work with other schools on is a holistic program. We call this a remediation audit, which means that we look through the structures and the processes within the structure and how it can be truly, for example, anti-racist. And when we have a look at that, where are the inequities of that? We do it through a lens that's also a youth approach. So it means that young people feel psychologically more safe when it comes to trying to share their stories, when it comes to being honest about their experiences, but also in terms of the decolonial lens, there's a lot that we can learn intergenerationally with that in order to foster true equity. So we do it through that lens, and that can be, say, policies, it can be internal procedures. We engage all stakeholders with that, so it means that nobody's left out of it. So it isn't just happening, say, in one department and nobody else knows what else is going on about it. We also do this through youth engagement within the system. So it means that young people are able to learn. So we may do a takeover for a day or a program that goes on for a good couple of weeks that really embeds that learning. So it isn't just here's a one-off assembly and that's it. So we see it through a long-term angle and approach. And we do that through the audit process, which the other school who's working with us, it's 3 years. So there's a lot that can happen in 3 years, a lot of changes that can be positive in 3 years, but also points of evaluation to see what isn't working and what is. That's a really good point to see that we can come in from an external approach and we can work with school for 1 year, but within a 1 year, the school can change, whether that is within our control or outside of our control. So we need to adapt to those changes with flexibility. The biggest barrier is often low cost or no cost at all. So it means that we take that financial barrier and we do it through a weightless approach. So it means that schools don't do any of the work. We do it. We do all the analysis. We do all the delivery. So it means that schools don't have the two burdens to worry about as well.
Amazing. I'm just finding this very reassuring, listening to all of it. In the world in which we live, where everything can feel so dark all of the time with the shit show that we can often see, it is so encouraging to hear of different organizations plugging those gaps and, you know, how we can learn from one another and how we can continue to educate and work together. It's really encouraging hearing as well, you know, you speaking about we are living in this kind of age of information. People are starting to ask more questions. You don't have to go far to recognize how people are accessing information, re-educating themselves and getting different perspectives from a whole intersection of society is very different to how it was 10 years ago. You know, we complain about social media and there are lots of negative aspects, but the ability to go online, learn from people all over the world and share ideas is incredible. I personally feel like something is on the turn. You mean, you spoke about the collapse of empire. I'd like that to happen a little bit quicker than it's currently happening. We have to believe that it is. You know, I saw this morning, even on Novara Media, they were posting like the Green Party are ahead in the polls in people under 50. I was like, wow, that's a new thing. The Green Party 10 years ago, people would be like, what, like recycling a newspaper? But no, it seems like something is turning. And this decolonizing lens that is being brought to so many different sectors, you've obviously just spoken about it in education. I'd love to bring that into the space of wellness because we obviously first met at Brighton Wellness Festival a few weeks ago when we were both speaking on the panel. I was hosting, you were speaking, and the panel was called It's All Connected. How can we move beyond personal healing to collective care? Yeah. Before we started recording, we both said that for us was the absolute highlight of the day. I would love to ask you how you define well-being, or perhaps we could say being well in today's society.
Yeah. I think just echoing our conversations that we had on that panel, if you consider to be, you're going to have a blueberry matcha and you're going to get your nails done, you're going to go have a spa day, even that in itself is not wellness. It's very much a tick box exercise. But if it has to involve capitalism, that isn't wellness. That is very much indulgence in the name of wellness. I don't want to be well where I look away from the state of the world and problems. I want to be well enough to know how I can show up to the fullest in the world that is full of injustices and be therefore informed in terms of how to take action. And I think wellness has been painted a picture of it's just a Pilates girl with her lovely set. Like, I don't think that's what wellness is. And it shouldn't be. I'm really keen on also community wellness. If wellness is just an individual practice, so it's not wellness because it means that only some people can afford it, only some people can indulge with it. Seeing how we can really adopt coalition, how we can adopt mutual aid, how we can be fully in community when we speak about wellness and being a well-being. And I think well-beings are people who can show up and hold each other in our fragmentations, hold us when we aren't feeling okay, and holding us in our humanness ultimately, because that's what wellness should be. It never should have been that we need to be 100% or we are doing okay in order to show up and to feel like we can therefore access wellness in order to be a well-being.
Yeah. Amazing. I'm so pleased that you mentioned that, because I was rereading one of your quotes that you sent me before the panel, which was, if wellness is about cute yoga sets and blueberry matcha, that's not wellness, that's capitalism. And I was like, that sentence literally personifies all the reasons why I love you. I would love to just go a little bit deeper into that. For many people, and I say this understanding the demographic of people that are only just coming into this, me, myself, as a white, heteronormative, cisgender, middle-class woman, is only more recently coming into a place of decolonizing myself, my work, my business, and my life. So I recognize that for some people, this terminology and coming into these types of conversations is relatively new, unlike for many people where this is just their life experience. But in what kind of ways, and this was a topic within the panel, how systems of oppression are perpetuated in the wellness space, mainly white supremacy and capitalism. Can you speak a little bit deeper into that?
So I think even if you try to picture what you think wellness is, you most probably already have a very colonized view on it. You most probably think that wellness is only accessed for white bodies within a space, also white, thin bodies within a space. It also means that within that, it is almost an escapism away from the world. So wellness is very much an opportunity to just, be present with each other and be in community, and you're indulging in what capitalism is telling you what it should be, which is further indulgence. It is more gym sets, it's more gym equipment, it is having that fine grade matcha that most probably was unethically exploited within the global south in order for you to have in the global north. So even the conversation in terms of production, in order to have capitalism that signal to you that this is what it should be, leaves out the origins of these products, further exploitation, and adds to that wider system. White supremacy comes into play because when we image wellness and what it should be, people perceive it as just white bodies who are thinner, and that coming back to trying to control people's bodies in terms of what it means to be healthy and thin, and that is a byproduct of white supremacy. Whoever said that healthy means you have to be thin and white, it comes back to that colonial legacy. Within colonialism, what people don't know is that colonialism actually was very much a deeply sexual conquest, which often is not spoken about. When people came into Africa and were coming to exploit the resources, how they drew Africa essentially with two breasts within an entry point. And we know exactly what that image is the penetration and that being non-consensual of a woman. So if we think about how that manifests into every day, it very much is playing on that stereotype of how can we exploit, especially women within the wellness sector. How can we therefore try to disconnect people within the wellness sector with that image? And, with the controlling of people's bodies, how can we make sure that they are thin? I think now, especially in the fashion industry, within the celebrity culture, it has shifted away from just curvaceous bodies, which we know exactly where that comes from, back into now much thinner bodies, and going back probably from 2000, early 2000s era. So when we think about how it's all interconnected, again, it is an intersectional piece. They all exist together. They don't just exist in a vacuum. They overlap to make us think that wellness is just something that only some people can have. If we have a look at institutions or spaces that hold wellness, if wellness suddenly is going on a retreat to Bali and you have to pay 600 quid in order to access this retreat, or you have to come to this yoga studio and pay 50 quid a session, it immediately excludes people from the access point of not being able to access something that has considered to be well. Actually, I think from the monetization of wanting things to be underneath wellness culture has disconnected and actually taken away from the roots and origins of where it comes from, which didn't mean you have to pay 50 quid to access it. It came from Black and brown people. It came from us being together in a space, and also were methods used in order for us to try to be as well-beings as we could do during injustices. So with that whitewashing of the origins of it, it means that now people have a very colonized view of wellness and often disconnect themselves from that point of it. Seeing how capitalism and white supremacy overlap and intersect is interesting when it translates to awareness.
And, you know, what was just coming up for me whilst you were speaking was that quote we mentioned earlier around education, that education can either be a tool for conformity or a tool for liberation, but never a neutral process. When you were speaking, I was thinking, just replace the word wellness into that, because wellness can either be a tool for conformity or a tool for liberation, but never a neutral process. Recognize that colonized perspective of the wellness person. You know, it's like a white girl in her Lululemons holding a green juice.
Yeah.
And how wellness just helps us be a better cog in the wheel for a patriarchal white supremacist society versus when we start to understand the systems behind our lives, when we start to decolonize our view of wellness, but also our lives in general, then wellness itself can start to be a tool for liberation. I know that in your TEDx talk, you spoke about Audre Lorde. I know that Audre Lorde talked about yoga and talked about well-being practices as a tool for resistance, a tool for liberation. I don't know if you have anything to say there.
I think there's definitely practices that if we are on the route to decolonize them, it doesn't mean we have to discard them. The origins of it, of where these practices come from, was to combat and to resist this. When we think about decolonizing, we can use them as a tool for liberation, a tool of resistance, because the empire deeply fears us being in community, being in connection, moving our bodies freely. They hate to see it because it means that we are not in fear, isolated in our homes, disconnected and not moving. They would want us to be in this fight or flight. They want us to feel psychologically unsafe. We live in a society that almost in architecture is structured to make us feel constantly in that fight or flight or to feel psychologically unsafe. So being in these opportunities and especially grassroots community spaces that create that, they hate to see it because it's no wonder that they will always signal that you need to have this amount of money in order to access this. If they suddenly see that grassroots people are offering their resources and mutual aid or even occupying open spaces, they hate it. Hence why, even with protest laws, it's underneath section 12 and 14 that even if you are stationary in a protest, it means it's a threat to the system. So that is within law and legislation, and in terms of how that translates to powers, it clearly is a resistance towards the powers that be. I think it's important for us to see it as decolonizing doesn't mean we have to discard it and go away from it. Actually, we can use the history of learnings when we look back and think, what are the things that we can take forward that we know can be things that can further lead us to justice, and within that, unlearn the things that aren't so helpful. Audre Lorde has definitely a lot of wisdom. I always seem to quote her. Her observations of even, say, in the 60s and 1980s really resonates to now more than ever before.
Yeah, absolutely. And this coming together and community, I really hear that it is such a threat to the system, to empire, the power of the people. And we're seeing that in the UK. We are experiencing the government trying to undermine protests, trying to slander protests, trying to stop people from protesting, prescribing direct action groups. Like there's definitely a agenda to try to quash the power of the people. During the global Samud flotilla, the Italian trade unions shut down the ports. The power of the people is incredible and terrifying for the system. To watch people coming together, it's very intentional that a lot of our wellness practices, as it has been developed in the West, is very personal healing minded. Whereas what you're saying, you know, within Indigenous culture, which is where we have taken so much of our wellness, the way that we've colonized Indigenous culture and appropriated in lots of places, it was all about community. It's all about coming together. Can you speak to that experience that you recognize as personal healing within wellness too?
Yeah, as you were speaking, it even made me think of mental health crisis, even within these wellbeing practices, especially with psychiatric institutions, which I would deeply abolish because they are not set up to help people rehabilitate. Actually, these practices were here to help people and hold them in a time of mental health crisis. That's something we're not going to be educated on or tell people, especially where you have the narrative of, and I think is often perpetuated through wellness of, you know, I'm going to isolate and I'm going to heal and I'm going to do my self-healing journey. And then I'm going to come back and have this whole glow up. Yeah. You know, the system wants you to do that inevitably because you self-isolating and being away from community means that you feel inadequate enough for you to show up as your fullest self. Being held in your humanness is what is at the core. Individual practices that have now been perpetuated often come from practices rooted in bringing people together and often in times of crisis, in times of injustice. So it's almost ironic that that's where the origins come from. And this is how it has been whitewashed to think that I'm just going to manifest. I think it's just manifestation. It pissed me off because it's like, okay, so you can manifest on your ones for a new car, but you can't manifest for liberation. Or you can sit there and bring out your sage, which often sage is unethically exploited within Indigenous people and their land anyway. And you're there trying to sage your stick and think, you know what, don't worry, I'm just going to pray for Jamaica, for example. And what is that going to do? I don't think Jamaica actually wants your praise. I think they would like for you to show up and be an ally. The more you look into it, the more you see how it manifests, the more it just doesn't make sense. So I think even if people are listening, they're like, okay, so what can I do about it? Just be curious and question as to why. That pathway for you to lead to that decision definitely comes from unconscious and conscious bias, but is bigger than yourself. So it is the systems at play that have caused you most times to come to that decision. We'd like to think that we're individual thinkers, but oftentimes our individual thinking resonates to a much bigger pattern, which is coming from the systems. I think that individual practices, I look at it and I'm just like, please, I don't need any more manifestation circles underneath the moon to help me and my people. I'd rather go to a protest and show the world that actually I will not be silent, and that being a collective action.
A friend said something to me a couple of years ago, which really stuck with me. Within the wellness space, the spiritual space, we're always talking about my highest self and being the best version of myself. She was like, why can't I just be my full self? Like, why can't I just be my whole self? Colonized language has worked its way into spirituality and wellness spaces so subtly. The way that we think that we always have to present this best version of ourselves, whereas actually if you look at the vast majority of Indigenous practice, it's about wholeness, heart work, shadow work, integrating the dark aspects, the repressed sides of ourselves, the exiled parts. And it was really coming up for me whilst you were speaking.
Yeah. That resonates so much. I think especially with the idea of the higher self or your best version of yourself, like that's you now. And I think capitalism has a lot to answer for with that, where it makes you think you're inadequate and has given you this pipeline to think that, you know, this ongoing cog of, you know, if I just keep reading self-help books and if I just keep buying crystals and if I just keep... So how did consumption also come into this? And also the consumption of your identity and your self-worth, thinking that if I keep judging myself, I therefore will become my higher self. Surely your higher self would want you to celebrate you now, would want you to show up in your wholeness, even in times where you know that you have fucked up, that you are not your best self, that you have the awareness to know that this is me right now. How can I show up and also communicate that? And I think there's a lot within that individualism, especially a lot of therapy speak, which has been weaponized of being like, oh, sorry, you're trauma dumping on me now, or I think it's just a lot for me to hold right now. So how come you can now speak about the person that you want to be dating, but you can't hold people in their spaces? I think there's a lot of weaponization of therapy speak, of spirituality practices, which comes back to the cogwheel of capitalism and colonized language. Colonialism has a lot to answer for within the spiritual realm and within religion, where they weaponize religion and strip people of their spiritual practices in order to colonize a group of people.
Yeah.
It has been a tool of which to maintain and take power over people. And a big part of that is shunning people away from their way of connecting with source to now it being you have to worship three gods within one entity. If you were caught practicing your spiritual practices, your hands would be sliced off. There was a lot of brutalism and almost cultural cleansing within that. So I think it definitely speaks to a wider problem, which comes back to the empire trying to hold its power. I'm fearful of the power that you have, and I'm deeply in awe of how connected you are to community, but I can't have that. If I want your power, if I want power over you, therefore I will strip you away from what you know and teach you that this is how it should be. Individualism speaks to a much wider thing of how I maintain power and control over you.
I'm so pleased that you brought in the weaponization of different aspects of therapeutic work, because a way that it really stands out for me, I saw an Instagram post earlier this year, last year, our time has melted together. In Western therapy, we are always talking about boundaries. And I'll preface that by saying that for some people, boundaries are really important. If you've been through abuse, if you have received violence because you have not been able to say no, we haven't been in a place where you've been able to assert boundaries in a healthy way, that is incredibly important. But and you brought attention to this, how much our kind of individualism of like, I'm asserting my boundaries and therefore I'm not going to be in this discomfort with you, versus in a lot of indigenous practices or in looking at therapy in a decolonized way, there's a lot of emphasis on rupture, or acknowledging rupture, on repair, on coming back together, acknowledging harm, ownership, accountability, and then coming back into a place of community. I mean, even I suppose what comes up for me there is taking that into the way that some indigenous cultures, when a crime has been committed, it's recognized as a whole community issue versus you have done something wrong and you're exiled. I mean, taking that into a comparison of our prison system now, that's a whole separate conversation. But bringing this back into therapy, the weaponization of like me, myself, and I versus this is a community experience.
Yeah. I think even there, like, there's a lot of language with which people don't know, but clearly language that has been given more airtime because it suits the empire to do so. For people who are listening, do you know the difference between a boundary and an ultimatum? If you don't know the difference between the two, you may have thought that you're setting a boundary, but you're setting an ultimatum, which often has disconnected people away from you. But in the name of, I'm going to do it for my well-being, for my mental health, to make sure that I'm sticking with my higher self. I think there's a lot of deliberate tools have been put into place to disconnect us. And I think, as you were saying, the whole thing of conflict resolution, very clear that isn't set in Western therapy, but you'll be soon in your first session told how to set a boundary, the window for tolerance, etc., and all those kind of things to almost micro-police somebody else's behaviour and assess them to see how it fits within your lens of wellness, which has been fed to you. So I think it doesn't, again, exist in a vacuum. It speaks to a wider problem. And even what you said about being exiled, you see the same thing happen within behaviour systems within education. You see that then, which is why such a thing as a school to prison pipeline, because it starts from exiling the quote-unquote naughty kid to the next minute the person who is in prison, which I believe is something like 70% of people who are in prison are those who were labelled that troublesome kid or didn't have the best experience in school or were excluded. So it is no wonder that all of these things come together, because almost as you would see of crucifixion, it's a public shaming of somebody for their behaviour that doesn't conform to how the system is set up. You therefore will be exiled and people deem that is okay because it's been normalised, when actually what normalised practice was, not even that long ago, was for us to be able to hold each other in community and to say, you know what, how can we show up and do our part to make sure that this person can be well in this space? So There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. What comes up for me also is things like conflict resolution, respectful communication, being together in our differences, how important that is for us to be able to get along in society, but yet how difficult that is for the average person to be in discomfort. Look at the last few years where there has been so much that has taken place globally. Your average person feels so much fear about speaking up or posting something in case they get somebody coming back to them, in case there's a difference of opinion, how ill-equipped we are within our society to be together in our differences, and how that is such an oppressive tool to keep us very divided. I know you spoke to this on the panel of how to be able to be together in our differences, and maybe you could speak to what addressing injustices can look like within wellness spaces and beyond.
Yeah, I think one way that you can do that on an immediate thing is confronting your own fragility that we all have. But within the fragility, it can manifest differently. You know, whether it is, as much as I don't like the book White Fragility, you know, do you have white fragility and how does it show up? I've been in many scenarios where I've done a training or a workshop or I've been in a conversation where I'm able to point out that this is white fragility, but somebody else would call it actually.
For anyone who doesn't know that term, can you explain that before we go on?
Yeah, of course. So white fragility is the same phenomenon that you have within conflict, where whether it is fight or flight, whether you shut down, whether you disconnect, any kind of response you have to conflict can therefore be applied to the context of race and your conversations within race, and often is found within white people who are confronted about racial inequities or racial injustice and don't know how to navigate it.
Please continue with what you're saying about white fragility within your spaces.
Yes. With the definition in practice, I've seen it so many times and I've had to identify and point it out to somebody. And by the end of it, they've had to go, actually, I didn't even realize that was my ignorance in play or how much it comes out. Normalizing that space, as you said before, kind of like that shadow work and seeing what the deepest side of yourselves are, that confronting that fragility and where it shows up, especially in terms of where you benefit from society, because yes, you can be oppressed, but also you can benefit. So mind mapping where your intersections are, how do you benefit from how the world is structured and the social hierarchies that are not factual. How can you therefore see how fragility can show up for that? How could it potentially manifest, even if it's away from race? In terms of conversations around pronouns, do you find it something that is daunting or you don't see it as important? What is that rooted in? Where it comes about disability justice for even simple thing as ramps on the road or any accessibility requirement, we feel like that's something that is needed. So anything that a community asks for in order to make the world more equitable, if your response is something like, actually, I don't think this matters, how does this apply to me? Why is that important? That's rooted in that fragility because you've never had to think about it at any point of your life. But rather than seeing it as a point of further judgment or guilt or shame, sit with the emotions that come up, hold hands with discomfort, because the more you make it a familiar friend and an enemy for you to run away from, the easier it is for you to be in spaces with people and to hold each other in our complexities and nuance. If you're not able to confront it and sit with that discomfort and you run away from it, then it's going to be much more difficult to do that. So confronting that fragility and seeing how discomfort comes up into play and making it your familiar friend, because that's the most consistent feeling you will have in this journey.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for that. And, you know, something was coming up for me whilst you were speaking. I know that a massive block for me within so much of this decolonisation work was the perception that I had that I was a good person and therefore I didn't perpetuate harm. That wasn't me. It wasn't until I got over that hurdle where I recognised how systems of oppression, how white supremacy, how patriarchy were alive in me by the identity and the society in which I have been brought up in. Once I got over that hump and recognised that, like, oh, actually I need to question absolutely everything, so beautifully drew attention to, was our ability to critically think about all of the perceptions that we have. And whenever we come out with something, it's being able to be like, where did that come from? Who gave that to me? And who does it serve me holding that believe.
Yeah.
And exactly as you said, the fragility when it comes up within us of thinking, oh, well, I need that person to like, oh, why are they making such a fuss about that? Or like, why is that important? Or like, our need to implicitly shut people down, for me is always an indication of like, oh, that was a little squeeze of empire that is within me right now. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I would love to speak to you about, again, we're going to quote Audre Lorde, but I know that she spoke about hope and despair. And I'm curious whether you experience despair ever and how you deal with it, if you do.
I think, not to say that I haven't experienced despair, but I'm really keen on radical hope. For those who don't know radical hope, if you have the phrase of, if we just blow up the world and, we start over again, everything will be okay. That sense of dimorphism, for you to feel like that's what change can only result to, that's our last hope, really, is what it speaks to. Actually, within the world of which we have right now and the people that we have on this planet, we are more capable than ever before in changing it with the history of learnings that we have to adopt it. So I think when Audre Lorde is speaking about despair, it is that sense of doom that we feel, thinking that in 2025, we're still experiencing this, normalizing that, yes, even if we do progress, there's going to be more things that come out to make you have the illusion that we're not making progress. Actually, it could be more things and more tactics and tools that the empire are doing to shut down your sense of hope. But with hope, we need to be critically thinking about it, because hope doesn't require you to opt out when it feels convenient. Hope should be a consistent feeling you have, even when it feels challenging to do so, because the empire wants you to feel distraught. It wants you to feel in despair. It wants you to give up, because it means that they can therefore maintain their power and control over you. I even think of the ceasefire that's just happened, and I feel like the amount of people that I most probably would have known who would have seen that as an opportunity to be like, yay, my activism's over. It's been 2 years now I've been doing it, and like, finally, ceasefire. And I'm just like, actually, let's wait. Because we can have hope, but we need to critically think here. Because if we've had a ceasefire before, and since then we had 900 violations of that ceasefire, this definitely can happen again. And what happened? And the next probably 2 days, I think it was, that they were therefore bombing Gaza again. We need to be critically thinking. Hope is not a tool for you to opt out of injustice where it feels convenient, because that's privilege at its core. But it also shouldn't be a tool of which you should also be fearful to adopt. I think especially in this climate, and we think about the amount that is going on, they don't want you to feel hope. Because when you don't feel hope, it allows you to be susceptible to propaganda, to be shut down, to opt out of your part to play in change. So we must have hope, but we also must have critical thinking to therefore accelerate that hope and put it into action.
I'm curious for you, if you notice a dip in your hope, what tend to be your practices for reinstilling hope within yourself?
I think for me, I haven't really had a dip, luckily. Not to say that I haven't looked around and thought, gosh, like, we're here again. But because of the deep connection I've always had with my ancestors and knowing that they have been here before, and what they have been through is way more violent than I am experiencing right now. They persisted. Even though they could not see hope at the end of the tunnel, they still strive for change and they still strive for justice, even when they were being slaughtered, murdered, even to the most brutal things we can imagine. So if I'm able to be here now and be a part of the lineage and also have the education, the understanding of what they went through, I can look back and think, you know what? They have been through so much that doesn't cancel out what I'm feeling right now. But the last thing they would want is for me to say that I give up, because they didn't put me here to give up. They put me here to carry that baton and to keep going and to ready and equip the next generation to take that baton from me and run with it. Because I know that the next generation, from the actions that we collectively do, will be able to run with that baton and won't be jumping across more barriers than we did. If anything, there will be less barriers if we continue to do the work. Knowing that every action, regardless if I see the results of it or not, add to that big picture, almost like a collective puzzle piece. If it hasn't fully completed itself yet, we have added more puzzle pieces to this big picture. If we hand it over to the next generation, they will be adding more puzzle pieces to this bigger picture. But it means that they don't have to put as many gaps in place than we did before. So knowing that it's bigger than me, and knowing that future generations are waiting on us to do it, but not in a sense of, oh, thank you so much, young person, you can take that now. It should not be that. But it's the sort of thing where it's the awareness of that intergenerational connection in action.
And I love that you drew attention to this. All of us being a small but important cog in the wheel of change, in the history of change, the future of change, the present of change, but also in the whole context of global change. White saviorism can have us thinking like, I have the weight of the world and the responsibility of global change on my shoulders, and if I can't get enough done, then I'm not doing enough, and all of the stories that cascade from that. But when we put it into this context, I am part of a very, very big ecosystem of change. I have my own unique contribution to that. And how do I sustain myself and engage, as you said, with radical hope? And I love that you position that as something that we don't get the privilege to opt out of. Then I feel like it really shifts something for me. There's Gabor Mate, who's my most quoted person, quotes a very old phrase from a Jewish rabbi from thousands of years ago. And I always bastardize this, but it's something along the lines of, the task is not yours to complete, but neither do you have the opportunity to, hang on, I've bastardized this horrendously. Hang on. Like, the task is not yours to complete, but neither do you have the ability to not engage with it. There's something like that. I'll probably take that out because I would ruin that quote. But anyway, it's been really supportive, that idea that the task is not ours to finish, but we still have to contribute towards it. Something that I remind myself of is the threat that is currently out in the sphere against empire. It's like, empire is never going to go down without fight. You know, like, the more threatened it feels, the more it's going to move forwards. That also gives me some hope at this time.
You briefly mentioned it, but within the colonial period, people thought that this population, who are simply existing, of loving life as they are, they swooped in, yes, with the intention of, I want to maintain control and have your resources from these people. But also from the sense of, these people are so hopeless that they are doing their own practices and they're literally just on their ones and they're so happy. But they came in and thought, you know what, I'm going to be the saviour and save you from your living environment. If we have sin that has caused colonization, the last thing we need is the saviour approach of, the world needs me. We can be humble enough to know that we all are irrelevant. And I sat with that. All of us are irrelevant. The cause itself, even if you decide to opt out, it will still be here. So you are irrelevant in it all. But what is relevant is the actions you take to strive towards equity and true justice. So I think, especially with the age of celebritizing people, in the age of, you know, you see people's page and you're like, oh my God, they've got so many followers, they're so great. Let's take the prestige away from it and see the humanness of it all. We are all here, relevant to the cause, but relevant in the grand scheme of things. So let's take away our ego from that and think about the cause at hand that can hopefully inform your actions in a more sustainable practice. I think that's the last thing I could leave you all with.
And I'm so glad that you did. That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Kaia. How can people get in touch with you to hear more about what you do? What have you got coming up?
Yeah, always love to connect with new people. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok. If you're a LinkedIn person, you find me on LinkedIn. That's the same handle. So Kaia, KAIA.AB. You can do the same for Edge Difference, no spaces in between. You can also do the same for Youth the Gap, no spaces in between. Always down for collaborations to see how we can further unite, how we can learn from each other. So yeah, just get in touch.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kaia. You have so much incredible wisdom. So thank you for sharing it with us. We'll have to get you back in for a part 2 at some point.
Yeah.
It's just so great to share space with you today. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.